excuse me, where you're joining from, and make your own acknowledgement there. So welcome. KM in the AM is a Saskatchewan-based community of practice for people who care about knowledge mobilization, research communication, and their real-world impact. KM in the AM stands for Knowledge Mobilization in the Morning. That's why we hold this on Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. As a community of practice, our mission is to support individuals, organizations focused on translating research into practical real-world applications that help create healthy communities. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Blayne Haggart for our session, Data, AI, Education, and Sovereignty, Understanding the Challenges. This is a huge topic, and thank you, Blayne, for joining us, because you are an expert, I think, in this topic. You're a professor of political science at Brock University. I also have a political science degree, so, you know, you're my people. Yeah. You are also a fellow at Vasily School of International Affairs and a senior fellow with the Center of International Governance and Innovation. Your research is at the cutting edge of international political economy of knowledge, exploring the complex worlds of intellectual property, internet governance, and the rapidly evolving landscape of data. Blayne's professional journey provides a unique perspective on how information is regulated and used. Before his career in academia, Blayne served as an economist with the nonpartisan Parliamentary Information and Research Service of the Library of Parliament and worked as both a reporter and editor. This background allows him to bridge the gap between high-level policy analysis and everyday realities of how data shapes our lives. Blayne is a prolific author whose work tackles the most pressing digital issues of our time. He is the co-author with Natasha Tusyov, I hope I got that right, of the new knowledge, information, data, and remaking of global power, and has edited foundational texts on power, authority, and internet and governance. A frequent commentator in the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and The Conversation. He's also known for making invisible structures of data and AI visible to the public. Today, he'll lead us in an exploration of how data-driven economy is challenging our fundamental understanding of sovereignty, including Indigenous sovereignty, and transforming the ways we approach education and training. Welcome, Blayne. I'm now going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to talk to everyone today. Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I'm talking or presenting to you all from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work in here today. The territory itself is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And today, the gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And, you know, among other things, acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living that we have here and throughout Canada is directly related to the resources and friendships of Indigenous peoples. And, you know, I'm starting with the land acknowledgement, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also for me, it serves as somewhat of a reminder of the importance of cooperations between settlers and settler state of Canada and the various provinces and territories, of course, and the First Peoples in Canada. But you know, in general, of course, but also especially when it comes to questions about data and AI, because it's fundamentally about knowledge, and knowledge is kind of like the foundations of society. And I think it's also important to mention, not just as a way to demonstrate respect for sovereignty in this area, but also because I genuinely believe that, you know, the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty that I'll be mentioning a little bit later, I think it has a lot to teach everyone about how we should be thinking about data and knowledge, how we should be dealing with it. So, yeah. I'm going to try to keep my overall comments as short as possible. Famous last words for an academic. Because I'm actually curious to hear your questions about it, because it's helpful for me, because I spend a lot of time thinking and researching and writing about data and AI and all of that. But it's, you know, it's always useful to see how people are dealing with these issues on a regular basis, and what they're thinking and what they're doing. So, and I've been asked to talk about two topics, data sovereignty in Canada and some ethics, and something on the ethics and risks associated with AI. And of course, these are enormous topics. There's no way I can touch on every single relevant aspect today. So I'm going to try to highlight some key points, and we can go from there. So I'm going to see now for sharing my screen. Let's see if this works. Share this window, and then, okay. So we're good with the screen there, I think,
Yep.
Hopefully.
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay, let's see if I can, all right. So, for those of you who want to know more about these topics, or at least my take on the topic, my talk today draws a lot on my 2023 book, The New Knowledge, which I wrote with Natasha Tuzikov. And it is actually, you can buy the hard copy for like way over $100, or you can download a free copy of it on the Bloomsbury site if you want it. It should be pretty easy to find if you just Google like Haggart, The New Knowledge, and Bloomsbury, and look for the free link. Also, just translated into Chinese if you are looking for a Chinese language copy. So in my presentation, I'm going to argue two things. So first, that data sovereignty is important because power in the global economy and society largely now rests with those who control data and the tools that run on data. Second thing I'm going to argue is that AI in particular, but and here I'm not just talking about kind of like large language models, but also what's generally thought of as being AI. They present enormous and potentially insurmountable ethical and policy challenges that really have been downplayed a lot in policy discussions. And I'm going to talk about two in particular. So I'm going to talk about decision-making algorithms in public policy, and also spend a lot of time on the use of large language models like ChatGPT in education. And to give away the second point, I'm going to argue that large language models should not be used in any research or educational context because they directly undermine the skills that our students are supposed to be learning in school. So this is a huge claim, might be controversial. Looking forward to your comments and questions about it. But I will hopefully see this doesn't come from nowhere. It's based on a decade of research and study. So for instance, this book came out in 2023, but it represents the culmination of about 10 years of work by Dr. Tuzikov and myself on what we call the knowledge-driven political economy. So onward. A lot of mine and Natasha's work in this area is devoted to demystifying things like intellectual property, data, algorithms, AI. All of these things are treated as things that non-experts can't help but not understand. They're seen as being almost forms of magic, something mystical. We got to get more data, turn it over to the algorithm, and they're just kind of invoked as if it's, again, like it's some kind of like sacred or mystical language. And data is very much one of those things that has attained this almost magical status. Everybody wants data. It's not an exaggeration to say that everyone from Google to Rolls-Royce to John Deere, as we'll see, is reshaping their business model to maximize data collection. Data is what fuels AI. Governments are spending billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on data centers to host all of this data. But when people talk about data, when we're talking about it, we rarely stop to think about what exactly data is. And this was kind of the starting point for our book, because it's a weird thing to not focus on this underlying thing, because we supposedly now live in a data-driven society, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the nature of data itself. So the first thing we need to do when we're talking about data sovereignty is we need to define what data is. And it's not magic, it's mundane. Data are simply recorded observations about the reality around us, about the world around us. That's all it is. Whether it's recorded on pen and paper, or by typing something into a computer, or using a digital sensor to record the temperature or whatever, this is all just observations of the world. That's all they are. The next point about data is that data is not just lying around waiting for you or me to collect it. Data is something that's manufactured. It's entirely human-made. And there's a famous phrase here from the NYU media historian Lisa Gittleman, who says that raw data is an oxymoron because it has to be created by people. Now, think about what that means. So first, think about how complex reality is. How, apparently there are more than 4 dimensions that we can experience directly, as physicists tell us. That kind of blows my mind. But, there's this world out there that we can't fully apprehend even with our senses. And then think about how complex human beings and how complex human society, how both of those are. What that tells us is that data collection in the world, it's expensive. And both of our senses and our conceptions of social reality are limited. So when we're collecting data, we always have to make choices on what we're going to focus on. What aspects of reality do we think are being the most significant? We can't collect everything all the time. And as data, our observations of reality, they're also limited by the tools that we use to collect it, because tools can't capture everything. They capture what we tell them to, and not other things. And what that means is that data itself, despite its reputation as being kind of like a neutral building block of knowledge, data itself is always and everywhere biased in one way or another. And what I mean by that, it's not a pejorative or anything like this. What it is, it's basically an acknowledgement that data, like the data that we collect about the world, it can never hope to be a full representation of this underlying reality. And so what that means is it's never ever neutral. Now, this lack of neutrality is a problem, as we'll see when it comes to AI, because AI being able to work at all, it's basically based on the assumption that data itself is neutral and unbiased, and it just isn't. Data comes out of a specific context for specific reasons. And it's also based on the idea that AI, or the algorithms that comprise AI, are built. They're built on the belief that these can make unbiased decisions better than people can. But this is fundamentally impossible, because data is created by people, and people are, as we all know, we are flawed, we are limited, we are imperfect. And that means that we are always going to, whatever we create is always going to be flawed, limited, and imperfect. And there will always be biases at play, unconscious or otherwise, just because we decide that certain things naturally we want to focus on and create data out of, and other things aren't as important. What I'm saying here is that you just, no matter how AI and the flight to data is really an attempt to basically get rid of people, and to create a form of knowledge that is separate from people, that is better than people. And unfortunately, you can't get rid of people. You can't ever escape people in the process of creating knowledge. AI and data, these will always be flawed because people are flawed. So data is simply observations of our underlying reality. It's a human creation, which means it doesn't and it can't give an objective view of reality, no matter how much we want it to. So data, as I mentioned earlier, has also become a significant source of power. Now, in the book, The New Knowledge, Natasha and I argue that we're currently in what we call a knowledge-driven society, in which control over knowledge has become a key vector of social, economic, and political power. And data is a key form of this type of power. So here for us, when we're doing our research, the book we kept coming back to is the one on your screen right now, Nick Srnicek's Platform Capitalism. It's a quick 100 or so pages. They're relatively small pages, so it's really even shorter than that. I can't recommend it highly enough if you want to understand kind of how the political economy of data and knowledge works. Now, Nick Srnicek argues that the platform has become a dominant business model. And what he means by platforms are, he defines them as businesses that are designed to collect data. And this data can be used to deliver a product, of course, but it can also be taken and repurposed and sold and used for other uses to other people for other purposes. So one way we can think about this is think about Google Maps. So if you, like me, are a Google Map user, it makes sense that Google needs your data in order to get you, say, from point A to point B. Where are you? How are you going to get there? A lot of data needs to be collected just to make the project work. But Google also takes your data and they sell it to advertisers, they sell it to other actors who might be interested in using interested in location data for whatever purpose. Maybe they're an insurance company or a government, or they might use it to train their AI programs. So for Google and other companies in a data-driven society, this data is valuable in and of itself. In other words, it is a commodity. Now, what this means is that this is the transformative aspect of the world that we live in now. It's not digital, it's not the internet, it's the fact that it's this approach to seeing data and knowledge as a product in and of itself. So think about it this way. What this means is that for Google, the purpose of Google Maps isn't to deliver a mapping service. It's rather to serve as a honeypot to get people's data, which Google can then sell or analyze and sell the results of its analysis. And it's not just Google who does this. You can put sensors on anything now, as I'm sure we're all aware. So a year or so before the pandemic started, I was at a clean tech conference in Ottawa, and a guy from the agriculture sector was telling me about sensors on tractors. And he told me that a decade previously, so the early 2000s, it used to be in selling the sensors to farmers. That's what companies wanted to do. That's where they made their money. He said, though, now the money isn't in the sensors anymore. It's in the data that the sensors collect. The sensor, the physical thing, has become the means to the way you actually make money, which is the collection of data, the collection of knowledge, and the analysis of knowledge. So data itself has become the thing that's valuable in our economy, in our society, and that's the big change, like I said. So yeah, the biggest change has been our attitude towards knowledge, the idea that it's something that can be commodified and turned into a product to be bought and sold. Here we start to get to the question of data sovereignty, finally. Now, sovereignty itself is largely an issue of control. And as I said, in a knowledge-driven society, control over data, who is able to access the data, who is able to use it, these are key ways that power can be exercised. And in talking about data sovereignty, I'm going to focus on 3 aspects of it, but I'll be happy to answer any of your questions that you have or anything about data that I don't mention here. So please don't let this limit you. And notice from this list here, these are the 3 things, that there are different power relations involved, including between people and companies, as in the first one, people and states, states and states as a digital sovereignty, and in the last one, indigenous peoples and the relationship with both states and companies. So this is the big first question that we need to think about, which is who has control over the data in question. So first I'm going to focus on what we call private data power. Now, in an economy centered around the control over data, power resides with those companies capable of harvesting, pardon the pun given the what's on your screen, and processing vast amounts of data. Now, remember, companies like Google and Amazon, they're the obvious big players in this economy, right? Because they're based primarily on data, they're digital online companies, but they're not the only ones. For example, John Deere, who I'm sure you all know about, now considers itself a technology company as opposed to kind of an agricultural manufacturer of agricultural machinery. They consider themselves a data company. And remember what I just said about the guys from the Clean Tech Conference, about how the money is now in the data that you collect from sensors, not the sensors themselves. Well, John Deere now is what he's talking about. Now, John Deere now employs more software engineers than they do physical design engineers. And it's famous, it's famous tractors, it's famous green tractors. They're now software reliant, and they've actually been retooled and set up to maximize data collection. In fact, John Deere refers to them as mobile sensor suites. So that's what's happening. That's a big change. But the big question from a kind of a sovereignty and control perspective is who controls the data. Now, in the case of John Deere, formally, they say that farmers, quote unquote, own their data. However, farmers, for the most part, don't have the ability to analyze this data because this data only becomes really valuable when it's combined with other farmers' data. So what John Deere is able to do is it's able to exercise power over farmers and over farmers' data through their ability to take all this data that's been collected with their tractors and analyze it. And then they can sell this farmers' data in the form of analysis back to them. This leaves farmers dependent on John Deere for their data, which then becomes a vital input into their ability to do their job. And they have to use this because if everyone else is using this John Deere data and they don't, then they'll be at a commercial disadvantage in their farming. So that's one example of the conflict in terms of data sovereignty. It's private data power. And there's a lesson here, there's probably a few lessons here. A big one is that ownership of data doesn't matter if you can't do anything with the data. Now, another key aspect of data sovereignty, which is the one I think that a lot of people think about when they are when they say the phrase or when they hear the phrase data sovereignty, is what we can also call digital sovereignty. And this is what the federal government has supposedly been focusing on with its digital sovereignty initiatives, its digital stack, and so on. Now, as part of these initiatives, the federal government has committed to spending millions of dollars on data centers located in Canada. And while this might seem like an expression of sovereignty, in the digital age, the physical location of physical assets matters less than who is using those assets. This is kind of what it means to be in a globalized, interconnected knowledge economy. So digital sovereignty involves control over the networks and data flows over these networks. And here's where we start to run into problems, mainly because of the way the federal government has defined sovereignty. Now, remember, power rests with whoever controls the data. In this case, the location of servers matters less than the companies that are running them. And under the government's plan, it won't necessarily be Canadian companies, or rather, the definition of Canadian, as far as we can tell, it's still very loosey-goosey right now, but the definition seems to be you have to have an office in Canada to count as a Canadian company. Now, this leaves the door wide open for companies like Microsoft or Lockheed Martin to get, or rather keep, a huge part of the Canadian cloud computing market or the digital market because they're quote-unquote Canadian. Now, as you can see from this headline, Microsoft is trying to, to take only one example, is trying to position itself as a protector of Canadian sovereignty. Now, I think one of the questions that questions that was sent in when you registered was about this, and if it sounds too good to be true, you're right. Because under U.S. law, if served with a court order, U.S. companies or U.S.-based companies have to turn over data on their networks to the government, no matter where that data is located in the world. In other words, U.S. law places U.S. sovereignty above Canadian sovereignty and other countries' sovereignty. In any case, court orders aren't really the biggest problem here. As you know, we've all had a front row seat to the madness that's going on in the United States, and after the last week's events, it's hard to call it anything but absolute madness. But what this means is that the United States is heading towards authoritarianism, if it's not there already. Tech companies have already bent the knee to Trump. What this means is that there's every reason to suspect that they would turn over their data even without a court order if the Trump government asked. That's a direct threat to Canadian sovereignty, and it's also one that's being completely ignored by Ottawa. But I'll also say too that this was a problem even before Trump. The U.S. government has always been very close to its online platforms, like say PayPal and Google, and they've been able to use this to influence them to basically act in ways that the federal government wants, even without court orders, even without a law in place requiring them to do so. So this has always been an issue, but under Trump and under an authoritarian U.S. government, it becomes a problem on steroids. I'll also note that this law affects all companies with exposure to the United States. Prime Minister Mark Carney has tapped the nominally Canadian AI company Cohere to deploy AI throughout the federal government. I say nominally Canadian because they also have a head office in San Francisco, and this would make them vulnerable to U.S. coercion as well. And I'd also note that the U.S. is dead set against rules for allowing data localization, that is, restricting the cross-border transfer of data. Now, these two examples, John Deere and talking about digital sovereignty here, it suggests why. John Deere's access to Canadians' data is a source of its economic power. U.S. access to our data is a source of political power. Both want to keep that power to themselves. The last point I'll make on with respect to data sovereignty is this. So, as the John Deere example shows, data sovereignty isn't just kind of a nation state issue. Data is knowledge, knowledge is power. And First Nations in Canada have been world leaders in thinking through the question of data and power as it relates to Indigenous peoples. But it also, again, like I said, it reminds us that this question of control happens not just between states, but within states, between companies and individuals and governments, and in the case of Indigenous data sovereignty, between First Nations or First Peoples and companies in the state. So, with respect to First Nations and thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty, I imagine that at least a few of you are probably familiar with these with their principles of OCAP, which they've been promoting and thinking about and developing for many years, and dealing with the idea of, and again, it's an acronym. Very quickly, ownership, referring to the idea that a community or group should own the information collectively in the same way that an individual owns his or her own personal information. And here we're talking about knowledge, but we're also talking in general, but there's also counts specifically for data. The idea, the C, for control, that First Nation their communities and representative bodies are within their right to seek control over all aspects of research and information management processes that impact them. At all stages. And this is something that at least at Brock University we take very seriously. But it also goes to the idea of who should control data. Here it's basically, it should be controlled by First Nations as a community and their representatives. Then the A for access, that First Nations must have access to information and data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held. And they should have the right to make decisions about access to this data. And finally, it's about possession, the idea that basically that they should have physical control over this data in order to assert and protect their ownership. And notice how complete this is. So all of these are in fact elements of control over data, control over knowledge, over its access, how it's used, the physical aspect of it. And I think there's a few things we can learn from that I'll get to in a moment. So overall, these three things together, several implications. First thing is, when it comes to data sovereignty, open data, the idea that everyone should have access to data, which is something that a lot of people have talked about, it's not enough. Because you also require, as the John Deere example suggests, the ability to analyze it. And this is something that gives big companies like hyperscalers or your Googles, your Amazons, it gives them an edge in basically exerting power through and over data. Second thing, on what we tend to think of as digital or data sovereignty. If the federal government is serious about reinforcing Canadian sovereignty, and to be honest, I can discuss this, I don't think they actually are, they need to take seriously the definition of Canadian companies and their exposure to U.S. influence. Third thing is that both the current lack of Canadian analytical capacity and the lack of companies not exposed to the U.S. market, which is pretty much every company, this suggests that the federal government needs to take a more direct role in creating data processing capacity, particularly in sensitive sectors like security and university and scientific research. We can't outsource these jobs to foreign companies or companies with U.S. exposure. And this means that this would involve not just building data centers, but also government owning and operating, say, as prime corporations, key services that are too sensitive to trust of the private sector. Finally, governments and others need not just to respect First Nations OCAP principles when designing data policy in terms of respecting control over data, but I think the rest of us should consider if these principles, these OCAP principles, also paint a way forward for other communities, for the rest of us, for settler communities, when thinking about how data should be used and thinking about who should control this. Should control rest with companies? Should it rest with governments? Who should it rest with? All right. Now, conscious of the clock, I'm going to spend relatively less time on AI, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about it. So like I said, AI, it's one of those things that's treated as a mystery, as something that's really difficult that you need to have to understand, that you need to be a high-level computer scientist to get this. Like a lot of things, there's some truth to that if you want to actually design these systems, but if you want to understand them, normal people can't understand them. So let's start with defining this thing, because, like I said, like data, it's wrapped in mystery. It's been given all this authority to basically that we need to defer to AI because it's this thing that's going to rework everything. People are using it to search for information and to do what they think it's creation. It's a sense of it feels like a form of magic almost. So what are we talking about? So whether it's something that, like generative AI, it depends on what we call neural networks, or more established technologies like search engines or audio scrubbers, basically programs that clean up audio, or any other number of mundane things. It tends to involve three things. So the first thing is they're just computer programs. Computer programs are tools created by people. They execute a series of commands in order to achieve an objective. Now, this can be as simple as what I was in taking computer classes in high school, telling a computer to output all the numbers from 1 to 100. It can be that. It can be to writing a sonnet, producing a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare. Here I'll say, too, getting back to the bottom one, if you're worried about sentient AI, don't worry about it at all, because it always has to come back to a person. Again, you can't escape people. And the person is the people, or the group of people who wrote the original program, who fed it the human-made data. Rather, the actual problem is when people, that there's a tendency of people to act as if it's alive and to defer to what its output is. And this is where the problem comes. It comes not from a sentient computer program. It comes from us believing that it is a sentient program, or that it produces a higher form of knowledge. So that's the first thing. It's just a computer program. Second, it runs on and produces data. And we've talked about that. So data, human observation of reality. The third point is that these programs are designed to look for patterns in data, to identify irregularities. And here I'm talking about programs that tend to be classified as AI generally. And the reason I mention that is because AI itself is a term. It's notoriously imprecise. And at this point, it's become more of a marketing term than anything specific. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is that these programs apply statistics in order to evaluate these patterns. It works on correlations, how likely or unlikely a pattern is to develop. Now, the academic Blayne Haggart makes a useful distinction when we're thinking about different types of quote-unquote AI, if we have to use the term. So he identifies what he calls discriminative systems. These are programs that detect patterns, say in breast cancer screenings, or that analyze patterns in users' search online to determine what are the most popular sources. So that's how, for instance, Google search used to work. A generative system, like your ChatGPTs, that generates probabilistic output based on the input data that it's given. It's like a question that you type into the chat box. And again, like I said, what AI is not, it is not alive. And so there's this talk about AI sentience and the move towards artificial general intelligence, even if it's coming from a Nobel laureate. And I don't say this lightly, it's complete nonsense. It tells us more about the people making the argument than it does about the technology. It reflects, as one political scientist put it, the Pygmalion myth, where an artist creates a statue and is so enamored of his statue because it looks so lifelike on the surface that he starts treating it as if it's human, and it's not. And so this is the same thing that we're seeing with AI. There's a tendency for it to replicate patterns of things we would expect from humans, but it's not human. It's not alive. It's as we'll say, it is a simulacrum. So, all right. So that's AI in general. Now, when we're talking about generative AI, most people will be talking about AI. This is kind of what they mean, like say your ChatGPT. So based on what we just discussed, what is ChatGPT? It's a computer program. It analyzes enormous amounts of data in its training set to find patterns, and it generates probabilistic output based on whatever input query that you give it. Now, the key here is that there's no thought going on. It only delivers output based on this probabilistic analysis of the word or pixel, in the case of a image generator, that is likely to come next, based on its analysis of its database. There's no thought here. It's what Emily Bender and others have called a stochastic parrot, in that there's no meaning in the output. And it's people who bring the meaning to what is basically, in a sense, kind of just a probabilistic string of data points. And what I say here is that it tells us what we it tells us what we want to hear. And that's a consequence of its probabilistic nature. So think about it this way. When you input a question into an LLM chatbot, you're asking effectively kind of a leading question. And it will output what it thinks you want to hear based on that question. But that's different than if you were asking the same question of an expert. An expert will tell you what you need to hear, in other words, what we might call the truth, based on their prior knowledge of an understanding of the topic at hand. They don't tell you what you want to hear. And then that's not science, that's not knowledge. It's also the characteristic of generative AI that leads to what's being called AI psychosis, where people get overly invested in a chatbot, even to the point of suicide. It's because it's designed to agree to you. It's designed to give you what you want to hear, not what you need to hear. And I'll explain this a bit more in just a moment. So there's a lot to say about generative AI and even discriminative AI, these decision-making algorithms that decide, for instance, when to inspect a meatpacking plant. That's the kind of system, for instance, that was used by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency a while ago that led to the deaths of 3 people from a listeria outbreak. It happened, again, because they had cutbacks, and they basically trusted the algorithm to give them the information that they needed, without actually going out and investigating for themselves. So again, this is this issue of trusting the algorithm is a recurring problem when we're dealing with these discriminative AI systems, these decision-making AI systems. Anyways, I have a list here. And I'd be happy to talk about any of these. Like, for instance, on labor, what we think about as the automation of kind of like these tasks, there's always hidden labor behind the scenes, because it's not just a matter of setting up the database and going. It has to be continually refined and fixed and made to work, quote unquote, correctly, usually through basically low-cost wage labor in developing countries. So there is there's a bit of smoke and mirrors always going on when we're talking about generative AI. But anyways, the two most important that I'm going to focus on here is about how AI isn't actually producing knowledge, and how the use of generative AI in any way can actively impairs, or even can, at a certain level, can destroy one's skill set. So, like I said, these are huge claims that have been, when we talk about AI harms, they tend to go unacknowledged. So big claims, how am I going to defend them? So here I'm drawing on this article I wrote when ChatGPT was released in late 2022, published in early 2023. But again, as soon as I saw ChatGPT, I knew I kind of understood what was going on and wrote about it immediately. So you can Google search this and read and see how you think it held up. And this will be the final slide, just to let you know where we are for time. So like I said, they're not producing scientific knowledge. They're producing a simulacrum of scientific knowledge, something that looks like scientific knowledge, but it isn't. It's a series of data points whose order is selected because its algorithm has calculated the probability that one word will follow from the current word. So for example, say I type in, "Why is the sky blue?" Now, even if you have no idea about the answer about this, you can guess what the answer will look like. You can guess what the next words are going to be, because they've appeared many times in the computer database, and we just kind of know it because it's been written many, many times. The first part of the sentence is going to read, "The sky is blue because," and then after that. Whatever follows this, and those words were true, but whatever follows is going to be determined probabilistically based on the time that, for instance, words like this appeared next to a phrase like "the sky is blue because," probabilistically. But it doesn't know the answer. And this is where hallucinations, what we call hallucinations, come from, because just like a deck of cards, sometimes a low probability outcome will happen. Even if it's a 1% probability, sometimes you pull the one card that you never thought you'd pull. So it's the same thing with ChatGPT. That's why hallucinations aren't errors; they're the system working exactly as it was intended to do, because it was not intended to create actual knowledge. Now, this characteristic of generative AI is a problem for people who need real accurate information, because within it there's no inbuilt way to verify its output. So this is unlike science, where the scientific method provides for verification. Hypothesis, method, observation, conclusion, theory, take all those together and there's a self-verifying of the knowledge that is produced from it. In other words, like I said, output produced by LLMs is not scientific knowledge. It's anti-science. It's closer to something you get out of an oracle or a fortune teller or mystical knowledge. In science, authority and legitimacy come not from the person, but from the method they follow. And here it's like trusting a black box oracle. Now, this is the new knowledge that we reference in our book title. It's new because people are acting as if these outputs are authoritative. The thing about knowledge, and here's where we get all French philosopher-like, is that these are different types of knowledge. And what matters for a knowledge system like science or religion or AI isn't whether it's true, but whether people believe it is legitimate and authoritative. Now, generative AI is anti-science because the legitimacy of its outputs is based not based on the scientific method, but based on statistical correlations within its database. It's without any kind of underlying theory behind it. In other words, it's closer to religion than it is to science. Now, all three of these, religion, AI, science, they're all knowledge systems. They have each has their own standard for what constitutes proof, what constitutes truth. And in this case, it's correlations for generative AI, the scientific method for science, and faith for religion. All three also, I should note, have their own high priests who maintain and propagate the knowledge system. So priests and holy figures in the case of religion, scientists for science, and engineers and tech bros for AI. And this is what makes our moment so revolutionary and so hard to get a grasp of, which is we're in the midst of kind of unthinkingly adopting a new form of knowledge, a new religion, a new way of knowing. And again, this is not scientific, it's anti-science. And the embrace of this form of anti-science that's actually replacing scientific critical thinking has led to a phenomenon that most people haven't fully grasped yet. We can't trust LLM outputs in and of themselves. But what's been happening is that people who have earned their, like pretty much everyone I'm sure in this chat or in this meeting, we all earned our expertise before LLMs, and we're effectively acting as a check on their output. This is not sustainable in any way, because the current generation of workers, researchers, and students are themselves learning from LLMs. Over time, this unacknowledged guardrail of this built-in overhang of previous experience is going to weaken, and schools, researchers, governments, and companies will lose the ability to verify LLM output, or basically to be crude, to distinguish kind of like scientific knowledge and truth from bullshit. This was, and we can do this because we are all kind of instinctively and innately trained in the tenets of the scientific method. Now, companies, ironically enough, recognize this problem. A survey of Niagara businesses by some of my Brock colleagues found that they are reluctant to let their new and junior employees use LLMs because they think they don't, and they're right, they don't know enough about the business yet in order to be discriminating in their use. They don't have the capacity yet to evaluate their output. And the key here is that these workers can only develop this capacity if they don't use LLMs in the first place. Even the companies behind the AI recognize this problem. And a friend of mine who works for a major US tech company that is at the heart of this revolution tells me that they screen their new hires to make sure that they don't use LLMs when submitting their computer code for evaluation. And this isn't just a problem for junior employees. As you all know, you're constantly honing and developing the skills that you've developed over years. And if you don't keep using these skills, you lose them. Now, when you use it, it's akin to dumbing yourself down, to taking that edge away. And if you're a researcher or a writer who uses LLMs for your work, and this might be controversial, I would argue it's tantamount to saying that you don't have the skills you need to do your job. Because that's the LLM paradox. Those who have the skills can probably use LLMs without doing too much damage to themselves, although over time you're going to lose those skills if you don't keep honing them. And those who don't have the skills, by definition, don't have the ability to fully evaluate the quality of LLM produced work. And the problem with skills erosion presents an existential problem for educators, which means it poses an existential problem for society. Because it's in schools and universities that we teach the skills students need to learn how to assess, how to evaluate, how to understand the world, and including in the jobs that they'll have once they finish their education. Education is all about process, but using chatbots short circuits the development of these skills, and because LLM output resembles student output, we as teachers can no longer assess with confidence that students have developed the skills that we're supposed to be teaching them. Now, as a result, we're starting to graduate students whose degrees tell you nothing about the quality, and we're starting to see these results in the workplace. I'm going to end here finally with two anecdotes. So a friend of mine in government has told me about having to cancel mass job hirings because all the people who made it to the interview stage based on their written submissions were utterly clueless about the jobs that they were being hired to do because they'd already outsourced their thinking to writing to a chatbot. They didn't have the skills to actually get through an in-person interview. One other story from the Harvard Business Review. They found that introducing AI into the workplace has caused more problems than it's solved. It's supposed to help with productivity. But instead, people who don't use generative AI are being forced to spend a lot of their time fixing the problems created by people who use Gen AI in their jobs because it creates so many errors that these people aren't capable of catching. Now, this tracks with what a senior civil servant friend of mine tells me about their employees, about how the things that they're writing using ChatGPT they're all almost right, but they're always a little bit off. And they have to spend so much time just correcting it to make it appropriate for the minister or for whatever. Now, the Harvard Business Review refers to this as work slump. And while the title here on the screen offers some optimism, in reality, there's no real way around this problem because of the truth that exists about any learned skill, which is use it or lose it. Now, I could talk for hours more about the subject, and I'm happy to answer any questions on it, but I'll leave it there for now. So thank you very much.
Wow, that was great, Blayne. I think I mentioned you and I come at AI from a slightly different perspective, and I really appreciate the perspective you brought here today. I agree with most of what you said, but except that AI generated content, which we're calling gray content because AI is really great at producing mediocre stuff. And it takes that human brain, that human spark, whatever it is that makes us human and creative, that's what we connect with people. And if you have AI do your writing, we're not connecting with that writing because the human spark is missing. If you think about reading your favorite author, why do you read that author? It's because that author has been able to address something in you. It's able to speak to you on something that you have in common. AI will never be able to produce that. So when I work with writers, and writers have been for quite some time afraid that AI will take their jobs, that it's going to make them sort of eliminate them from the table. But it's never going to happen because AI cannot replicate what it means to be human. It cannot replicate what your experiences are, your thoughts, your hurts, your joys, what it means to be you. And AI can never, I believe, actually replicate that. Which leads into something that you said about students earlier on, that they're using AI, but they're just not meeting the grade once they get there. Because I believe that when we use AI to write for us, we don't actually know what that content is, right? If I use AI to write an email to you and put in all sorts of stuff, before I meet with you, I'm going to have to reread that, but I didn't produce it, so my brain isn't connecting with it as my work. And so we find that that's a big issue. When you said people are creating their resumes and letters to apply for jobs, but they don't understand the job because they probably didn't really read the job description. They didn't generate their written material. So when they get to the interview, that you can definitely tell that that's not sticking with them. They were not the authors of those things. And that's my opinion on it. But how do we mitigate that in the classroom? Right. So if students are using it, they're not going to let go of it. AI, I don't believe, is going to go anywhere. I think it's here to stay. Mm-hmm. So how do we mitigate losing some of those skills?
Yeah.
that sort of.
Well, this is what I'm saying about like this is the hard truth. I'm saying is you can't, because with respect, the perspective that you're bringing to it is a perspective of someone who has spent decades in the pre-generative AI era developing the skills in order to be able to evaluate what counts as a human spark. Human spark doesn't exist. It basically, what counts as human is something that is developed by the society, by the culture. And what I'm saying is that we're graduating people who we're basically undermining the education system by taking away the ability to work through that process. This is the paradox: is that you can only evaluate generative AI and recognize the missing spark if you never used it in the first place, if you developed it outside of that. The logic, and I know people don't want to hear this logic, but this is the logical conclusion from it, and it's unavoidable, is the only way that you can develop this skill that you say in order to recognize the spark is if you do not have it in your education system in the first place. And then I think also that a lot of people are far too confident in their ability to think that basically once I've gotten to a certain level, I've got the right ability to do this. But like I said, you use a skill, you need to use it or lose it. And if you keep and I notice this a lot. Like I'm thinking, my friend that I referred to, he works for one of the biggest platform companies in the world. He has a PhD in computer engineering. He graduated top in Canada. So he's like the absolute top of in computer engineering with a PhD. Here's how he described it to me. He says he uses Copilot, I believe it is, in order to help him with some basic routine coding. And so I told him, who does that? But then he said, I would never let anyone with less skill than me on my team use it. The fact that Google and Microsoft and these other companies are actively screening to make sure that generative AI isn't being used by people for something where the best use case for this is probably coding, and they don't want it anywhere near this, is because they're so worried about this. And when you've got people at the senior levels of the civil service basically saying that there are workers who are in their 20s and 30s, and they're saying they're bright, they're smart, like there's an innate brightness in students that I love seeing in our classrooms, but they're coming out and the stuff that they're producing is garbage, and they don't recognize it as garbage because they're using these skills. And so I know people don't want to hear this because, and this whole is that it comes down to this. Are you serious about having an education system? Are you serious about educating students? Because this is the choice that we're facing here.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, because in my daily work practice, I do use AI, and I use it for several different things. I never use it to think for me or to write for me, but one use case that I really enjoyed having is I can ask it for the opposite perspective to what I'm thinking, and it will lead me down. It will lead me somewhere where I can take that further. So like you and I, we have an opposite perspective, right? But I found you on the radio. I didn't found you through AI. However, I can also, ask AI to tell me what the opposite perspective is for the article I'm writing. And I think that way it does help me be a more well-rounded writer. However, I never, ever, ever take AI at its word. It's 95% correct, but it's 100% accurate at convincing you that it is correct.
If I could just ask, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but how do you know that it's giving you the right opposite perspective if you can't trust it?
I can trace that, right? So I will then take it and I will do my own research. So it may give me a start.
Okay, why that first step? Why not do the research in the first place?
If I don't know what the opposite perspective is and I don't know where to start, right? So then I can use it to give me a starting place. It never, once I get that starting place, I can then send an email to someone like you and ask a question. And folks, most experts are really happy to answer your questions. So don't be afraid to email them, and don't be afraid to ask those questions.
I will say though, that if someone came to me and says, I found your name through AI, I'd be much less willing to talk to them.
Really? Because that's important to know.
Yes, because like I said, this is a crutch. And it's a crutch that we see with our students is that when ChatGPT first started becoming a big thing, the one thing they said you should not use it for is search. Because like I said, it's not a search engine. And we train our students, where do you go to find valid information? Because here's the other thing about ChatGPT and these publicly related big LLMs, is that they're getting the opposite perspectives from Reddit. Like basically, it's trained on cesspools. It's only as good as what's in its database, and there's no way for you or anybody else to check where is it coming from. And it's only giving you the most probabilistic things, which means it's not giving you necessarily the information that you need. If you do a Google search engine, that's kind of a discriminative system in the way that it basically searches, and it has its problems. But the way that it's set up is that it basically the links are returned to, generally speaking, based on popularity. But then you can kind of go through and say, oh, I've got a medical problem. I'll listen to the Mayo Clinic. I'm not going to listen to WebMD. And that in turn is different from going into a library and talking to an actual librarian who has absolutely subject matter expertise and say, here are the 5 sources that you really have to look at. So I would like I said, one loses a lot when you use large language models in a way, and it erodes research skills like that.
Yeah, and I think so. Like I said, with us writers, some writers are now using it to get their work to a really good place, so they can then go to an editor and have a really good place to start with. And what I mean by that is that we do the writing, we sit down and do the writing, but that final copy edit, we'll do that with AI or some other tool that will, fix the comma splices, that'll fix, the mechanics of writing. And then I can go to my editor and say, okay, here it is. I need your opinion. But you know what? The human is never removed from that loop.
You're removing it from it. And I feel like I'm dumping on all of your life choices. I honestly don't mean to do that.
I absolutely love this.
But I like, the one thing I love in life more than anything else is writing. I mean, this is why I got into academia. I've been writing like for my student papers since I was like 18. I've never stopped, and it would be the death of my soul to turn it over to anything like that, because quite honestly, like, when you ask a generative AI or Grammarly in its current form to smooth out your writing, you're blandifying it. And I mean, that might work for like if you're doing like ad copy or something like this, but that's how you take out the human element, and the comma splices and things like this, and like the split infinitives, and things that actually gives. And in fact, what I will also say too is in university now, it's become a mark of concern if the writing is too smooth, if it's too generic, because then you can't trust it. It's gotten to the point where I'm always happy to see like a couple of misspellings or something like this, because
it's that generic writing. You don't have that human. If it's that generic writing, you automatically know that there's no experience in that writing.
Well,
we can actually start detecting what some of this gray work slop is by using those, by using our brains to critically think.
In university, I mean, I also think that that a lot of like kind of like generic copy copy is it's generic for a reason, and it will resemble. It will resemble AI because AI is the median, and it's the same thing with like a generative AI can produce a B minus to C plus level paper. But the problem though is that when you see a real minus to C plus level paper, there's still value in that for the student, because if they've actually put in the work, they might not be the best student, but they're still putting in the work. They're still learning from it. Even if you're a C student, even if you're a C or C minus student, you're still learning something. But if you're turning it over to chat, then you're learning literally nothing at all. And the problem for us is that it's becoming harder and harder to distinguish between kind of generic low-level stuff and automated stuff. It's a real issue.
Right. So, I've noticed a few tells, right? So words like resonate often in AI generated content. Words like keen, or some of these overused words that we've used to the point where they actually are meaningless. An actual writer will use their head and say, so I never use the word resonate. I absolutely hate it, and I will edit it out of everything that comes my way, because I don't think it holds a lot of meaning anymore, and there's always a better way to say something. AI can't tell me what that better way is, but
It is though. It is though. I'm sorry to get upset, animated here, but it is. When you said that I take it and I smooth it out and stuff, that's telling you the better way to do it.
I do writing, right? So I write my first draft, I write my second draft. When I go to AI, it's to ask a question about something, or I'll use a Google search about something to ask a question, but AI never writes for me. I don't use Grammarly. I use AI to do a final copy edit before it goes somewhere, just to make sure I didn't miss anything. But even after that, I'm still reading it. It's still me. I'm reading it. It doesn't make changes for me. It may make suggestions on the side, but you know what? I make that decision on whether to use that. Everything I write is literally me. There is no AI writing for me, because I don't believe it can do as good a job as me. That might sound self-serving, but I mean, I'm a pretty decent writer. I've made a career out of it. So, and I was working, like you said before, I was working long before AI came on the scene. I was working as a writer when we were using typewriters. We didn't even have computers yet. And we were sitting in the bowels of the library and having those chats with the librarian. And I have those skills. I enjoy those skills. Like you, writing is part of me. It's who I am. And I need to do, and so I'm never going to give that up, give that satisfaction up to a machine or anyone else. I've even had editors where I didn't agree with them. I've pulled my pieces because I didn't agree with what the editing process was. And that was a human, but I haven't lost that.
I'm more interested. I'm more interested in the younger generation, in my students, and I want them to have that ability to discriminate. And that's not going to happen if we keep using generative AI in schools.
And they are using it, right? And we're seeing it. I mean, at the high school level, they're doing their essays. At the university level, they're doing their research papers, and we know this because we've seen the signs in it. I mean, some people just copy paste and don't even edit what they've pasted, and you still have those little preambles saying you asked me for this and here's what, and they haven't edited those out, which is crazy to me. But I mean, it has happened at all levels of education. And so how do we get our students, how do we get our students to realize that this is not the be all and end all, that they have that talent, and how do we nurture that talent to make them not rely on tools like that? Make them go back to the thesaurus that you hold in your hand, or the Oxford Dictionary to look up words. Like, how do we get our students to see that? Because now they think that life is easy. They can use AI to create anything they want to, from prose to pictures, right?
I think the way that you do that is, well, the problem is that it's a systemic issue, and it's beyond any teacher to do. But the basically comes from, like I said, banning it in schools. It comes from basically, for instance, now everybody uses Microsoft Word, right, as their word processor. But now Microsoft has changed their product so that now that there's a little, colorful orb at the top or the bottom of the screen saying, let me summarize this for you. And so right there, you've got the constant temptation to use this. So that's not good. So this should be, like I said, these stuff should need to be banned by schools. The problem, though, is that school boards and people who, quite honestly, should know better are saying that this is the wave of the future, and people need to learn how to use them, and that's just wrong. I mean, the whole point about chatbots is that anybody can use them. You don't need to be trained how to use them. If it's important for your job, like Excel, you'll figure it out afterwards. We're here to teach much more basic skills and thinking, and so it starts with recognizing that these are harms and then kind of going from there. But this isn't something. The one thing I will say is that I don't think people realize exactly what a disaster is coming. I'm 53. I thought when I started this job that was that a surprise or horror? But when I started this job, this is the golden ticket. This is the best possible job in the world. I get to write, I get to research, I get to basically teach students who are inspiring, Um, you know, it's great to be around like young students, and they're so optimistic about everything, and it's wonderful to teach them. But I thought I'd be doing this into my 70s, because this is a job you could do forever, and I love doing it. I love writing. I love everything about it. But since ChatGPT, I'm on the exits. The first moment I have, I'm going to be retiring, because it's not worth it anymore. Because we're being undercut by school boards, we're being undercut by administration, we're being undercut by colleagues who refuse to recognize this as the existential crisis that it is. It's made us literally impossible to assess student development, because the essay in the social sciences remains the best possible tool for evaluating student ability to research independently, to synthesize knowledge, and to communicate that knowledge. There's no other replacement for it. And people keep saying, well, I've got to update the essay. Tell me what tool that will be, and I'll use it. But they haven't, because it's not there. And so what I've done is, I've considered kind of revising my entire curriculum to get rid of essays. And then a friend of mine who I've known since high school, he is now a university professor, as he puts it, at a fourth-rate Japanese university teaching business English. But I was telling him about this, and he basically looks at me. He's actually wise. He said to me, he says, "Why would you stop using the best tool that you have to evaluate somebody just because some people are cheating?" So what I'm doing is I'm still assigning essays, but those essays where before they were for everybody in a sense, now they're for the people who want to take the effort to actually do it. For everybody else, you go through there, and there's still a lot of students hate it, and they don't want to use it. But everyone else, like this attitude, everybody's using it, everyone's got to use it. They feel the pressure to do it. And so they're going to use it. And I tell them at the beginning of the year, you're going to get a grade. If I don't catch you, and I caught about 4 out of 24 students using ChatGPT, and in my last semester. But for the others, some of them they're going to get through. But I just tell them, says your mark that you get on this, it's meaningless. It tells you nothing about your quality or about whether or not you've learned the stuff. And so I tell them it'll catch up to you eventually, because if you're not developing these skills, you're not going to get the job. Problem there is that students.
You're right, and I've seen people actually flounder. When I've interviewed people, I've talked to folks who are submitting stuff that they've written through AI, and like I said, they don't even recall what they've actually written, because they didn't write it, right? And the only way you can recall that is when you write it from your own mind, from your own head. I see that Lila has her hand up, so unmute yourself and go ahead, Lila.
I made a comment in chat that there is a difference between niceness and kindness. Niceness is affirmation of whatever. Oh, this is a wonderful thing. But kindness actually looks at the person and tells the person, dig them out so that they will actually develop themselves. That's kindness, not niceness. Mm-hmm. I just heard that this morning, and I'm thinking that is a major difference. Kindness versus niceness. Niceness takes a short term. Kindness is much more long term as far as the learning capacity. And I'm 79 years old, and I'm still learning.
You look really good, Lila. You look great. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that goes back to your comment, Blayne, about, AI tells us what we want to hear, but an expert tells us what we need to hear, right? Mm-hmm. And that's I really love that parallel that you set up there. That is something that's going to stick with me from this presentation, is that specific. And I love that you used the John Deere example about owning our data, but not having the skills to use the data, so it's actually meaningless. And big companies are swooping in, and they've picked up on this. And so they get our data, we give it to them for free, and then they sell it back to us. And that with all the big companies, not just the tech companies like Google and Microsoft, but I think other companies are now jumping on that bandwagon, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a reason why the federal government has exempted political parties from its data privacy laws because everybody wants this data. But the problem is that again, data is power, and it's often going to be used in ways that aren't in the interests of the people who create it. So I mean, it would be one thing, for instance, if John Deere was, say, a cooperative and the data was pooled by farmers and they could all use it for themselves. But what this ends up doing is it ends up basically removing it turns basically farmers into digital serfs, which is something that I think a lot of between right to repair, 1000%, absolutely. This it's all about this kind of control. Who controls these devices? And it basically comes down to, if you don't control if you don't control the software, if you don't control the data, you don't control the device. And it's true if it's a Roomba. It's true if it's a kind of a Nest thermostat. It's true if it's a John Deere tractor. It's also true if it's an F-35 fighter jet. So this is like a huge issue, and one that doesn't really get fully acknowledged because of two things. First of all, there's we always think that, like, there's very little that's kind of more physical or tangible than agriculture or a fighter jet. But understanding that these things are mostly about software now, and it's mostly about data, changes how you should think about it. And the other thing too is that people desperately, and this gets back to the AI thing, is that people desperately want to believe into the promise of AI, and that it can basically, we don't have to work anymore, that we can outsource all of our decision making to this, and it can't work. These things, it's a terrible technology, and again, I am not anti-technology. I've been like on the internet since the early 1990s. Like I said before, I was taking computer science classes in like 1987.
Back in the days of message boards, the internet was just message boards. Yes.
BBSs and message boards, IRC. Yeah, but yeah. So I've been there from the very beginning, early adopter of so many things. So when I'm telling you that this is a terrible technology that should, quite honestly, and again, this is the scale of the issue, it should be taxed almost out of existence. It should be held to the same quality standards that we hold. Like in any time, a search engine like Google, like the AI bot on Google Search now, we wouldn't be, like 20 years ago, we would not have been satisfied with saying, oh, this is mostly, like, you can't trust it. That would not be good enough for us. If a librarian was judging this, they'd laugh you out. So why is it good enough now? And the answer is it's not, but basically our standards have changed. I would say dropped, but this is this new knowledge, the idea that basically that this is good enough and that we can basically outsource all this stuff to tech bros, to AI that doesn't create scientific knowledge. It creates this kind of simulacrum of scientific knowledge, and think that's good enough. That basically even the idea of, again, I'm going to come back to the smoothing of the writing, that it's what we're starting to see is students having less confidence in their writing because it doesn't meet the AI style. Because AI has, like generative AI and chatbots, they have a certain style because it's, again, created by certain types of people, and who have their own views on what counts as style and what's in its database. And so basically, you're outsourcing your own style, your own individuality to this when you're feeding it through for a smoothing or for whatever. And now we're in a situation where students are reluctant to make the mistakes and make the quote unquote kind of like bad sentence construction that you all have to do in order to kind of develop yourself as a writer. And so again, like, I understand and I hear everyone saying that it's inevitable and all this. I don't think it is. I don't think it should be. I think honestly that this is an existential threat because when you talk about, like, for instance, the emergence of the printing press, accompanying that was a move away from religion as a dominant form of knowledge and priests and the Pope as kind of like the dominant knowledge creators in society towards science. And this, good and bad, I would argue probably good outweighs the bad, but it gave us a way of thinking about things. It created our egalitarian society in a sense. A lot to recommend it. What I'm saying is that this is not a technological revolution. This is a cognitive revolution. And it basically, if you like science, if you appreciate the things that science has given us, and the kind of society that it's produced, then we should think very, very clearly, or very carefully about what we're doing with generative AI. Final thing I'll say too on this is that one of the questions was about how, from the registrations was, how, with respect to how can social researchers support Indigenous communities curious about how AI can be used to support traditional language preservation and knowledge sharing. And so the first thing I'd say to that is that I think that's for Indigenous communities to decide, like for them to kind of approach social scientists or whoever and ask, say, here's what we need. But one of the questions, and I think this is a key point to keep in mind when we're thinking about unintended consequences, what's the purpose of this? Why do you want to basically preserve this language as using AI? Because there's always different ways to approach a problem. And when you AIs and large language models, you're automating something, and you're automating it according to other people, whoever designed the machine, you're automating it according to their principles. And when you automate something, you're basically cementing current ways of doing things, but you're also stripping away from it certain practices that are seen as extraneous. So think about like automated contact tracing with the COVID alert app that we had a few years ago. This was sold as a way to do contact tracing more efficiently, but it did so by, among other things, cutting out the relationship between the contact tracer and the public. And this is a relationship that builds on and reinforces trust and allows the contact tracer to educate people and to reassure people that they're building the trust with. And the one thing that we might want to think about is that trust is something that we could use a lot more of right now. The convoy protest and the Ottawa occupation was driven in large part by an explosion of suspicion and letting paranoia run rampant in Canadian society in a very unhealthy way, and it might have been even mitigated if basically, say there were say tens of thousands of students out there who weren't doing anything otherwise, trying to help out, contacting their neighbor, talking to them, reassuring them that this isn't a huge conspiracy or whatever, and basically acting like neighbors to them. So, yeah.
No, that's a really good point. Yeah, I don't know if I'm convinced that we can turn away from AI as a society. I think I see, you mentioned the invention of the printing press. I think in every major shift, we've asked the same questions, and I don't think we've learned the lessons yet. Like when computers came into our households, where everybody had one, we asked similar questions then. We asked similar questions when social media came on the scene, and everybody was telling us we have to be on social media, we have to have a website, we have to have a blog, we have to do this, we have to do that. And as we are finding out now, social media hasn't been the most beneficial tool, and it's actually created a negative influence. You just have to look at Instagram and what our kids are looking at.
Yeah.
And when I was a teenager, I looked at Teen Magazine, which was bad enough back then, and body image and self-respect and all of that. But now we've got all of this internet, and now these pictures of different people in different scenes are being AI generated, coming with certain biases, because it's not, as you mentioned, it is not unbiased. I mean, it only knows what it's been trained on, and whatever's prevalent in that training data is what it's going to give you.
Yeah,
at these made-up images, and I think it's destroying our kids to the point where you mentioned there has been cases of suicide. I know in Florida, it took ChatGPT to task because her son committed suicide because of the chats he had with it. And yeah, so I mean, these technologies have a dangerous dark side, and I don't think we give enough attention to that, right?
Well, I think that on the inevitability, one thing to keep in mind with respect to generative AI in particular is that we are in the middle of an enormous financial bubble, and the reality is that the economic benefits from generative AI don't come anywhere near to matching the amount of money that's being invested in it. So a lot of what's going on is basically just kind of like FOMO. It's basically it's policy FOMO. It's basically fear of missing out, and so everyone's jumping on the bandwagon. So in terms of stopping that, that's an issue. And it is possible, and this is why I find the whole discussion about AI so frustrating, is because it's not like there are no good use cases for pattern matching. Another friend of mine, I'm fortunate to have friends from high school who've gone on to really interesting careers. And one of his students had, or it was either him or one of his students had a program on like the Mars Discovery orbiter for evaluating, for analyzing rock samples, and it had some machine learning in it. And he said, like, that's amazing. Like the machine learning that are in cars right now that basically allow you to it's not fully self-driving, but the stuff even that we have in cars right now that basically keep you within the lines, that's pretty amazing too, and that could fall under a quote-unquote AI. So there are technological uses for it as well. I was at a presentation yesterday where one of the questions that came up was about the US versus Chinese approach to AI. And so the US is going large language models, proprietary ones that no one knows what actually is going on. So when you're using these models, you're basically outsourcing it to a black box. You're outsourcing your work to a black box. You have no idea. Again, this is why I say, how do you know you can trust even like it's what it's suggesting for anything? And there's no way of knowing that, because you can't adjust the weights. You don't know what data it's trained on, and so on and so forth. So that's the US approach to things. China's taking a much more kind of like low key approach to things, working, like trying to incorporate it into things in the background to make various kind of industrial processes work better, work more smoothly. That kind of automation where if they didn't tell you it was quote unquote AI, you'd look at that and say, okay, yeah, so you've just kind of improved that project a little. It's more like kind of like safety devices on cars as opposed to self-driving. So there's different ways of doing this. And what that tells us, though, is that what we're seeing is the result of choices. It's the result of, basically, we've outsourced our development of these things to basically the big US tech companies who do not have our own interests at heart. They certainly don't have Canada's interests at heart. And we're okay with that. Same thing with social media. Social media would look differently if it were treated as a public utility as opposed to a for-profit entity, designed to maximize engagement and therefore, like, siphoning data. So there are choices here. Unfortunately, and what people don't really like to hear is that the choices that we have to make are who do we want. Basically, would involve telling Google and Microsoft, you can't do business here because you can't do it on a for-profit, because that's driving a lot of this. Or you can't tell Meta. And Meta and the United States government would raise holy hell on it. But again, I'm not here to give, I'm here to say, if you want this, then this is what you have to do. It's the same thing with education. And this is why I'll probably be retiring in 5 years, is because it seems like if people don't start to listen, then it's going to be pointless for me to be an educator because everyone's telling me that we're not interested in education anymore. But this is the choice. If you want an educated population, if you want our students to have the same kind of opportunities and the same kind of critical facilities that we had growing up, then you will keep AI out of schools. If you don't, well, good luck to you. I don't want to have any part of it, because it can't be done, is what I'm saying. So these are the choices, and based with those choices, we make our decisions. We should make our decisions no matter how hard the policy debate might be.
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying there. Like when I went through high school, I hand wrote my essays. I researched them, and the teacher provided guidance, and you hand wrote them several times until it got to a place where you could type it up and then hand in a typed copy. That process alone made the information stick in my head because I was going over it so many times, right? And it was coming out of my head. My kids in high school, and they're in their 30s now, they had computers. They had Google. They were able to copy and paste from certain places. And I don't think the information that they learned stuck with them as well as the information that you and I, or as the process that you and I grew up doing. Mm-hmm. I still handwrite my articles, right? I was digital for a while, and I just found the process of handwriting, from it coming to here, and out on the page, that is something I enjoy. And so that is something I can't. And then, at a certain point, I will actually put it in the computer, but I'll OCR it instead of, typing out every word again. But I mean, it sticks with me. I know what I've written, right? 20 years ago, I can tell you about articles that I wrote for a local paper or wherever, right? Because that was my process, and that made me a better writer. And you can see that being taken away in a big way. And you're right. I don't think people are asking these questions and being critical enough of these processes that involve, AI. Now we're talking about AI, but and I think it's up to folks like you to bring that perspective out. So I really hope you don't retire in 5 years, because I think people do listen, and the more people that talk about it in this way, I think we're going to get to a new place where we can look at these tools. Well, I don't even like calling AI a tool, because it's kind of more of a process, right? So when we're using things like this, and it's not going to end there. I mean, people are going to continue to invent more and more different technologies. Unfortunately, you already blew my bubble about Skynet approaching. I mean, come on, Skynet would have been really cool.
Would you be able to answer the question from P. Moore? Would you be able to get on the mic and say, what do you mean by that? Because I find it interesting.
Go ahead and unmute yourself. And
No?
how and concepts to include analytic availability. Yeah.
I mean, that's okay. So one way we can think about that too is like already they're talking about using basically. Oh, well, let's see if I can answer. We can always like one of the issues right now comes out with respect to surveys, because I mean the big issue is always getting representative surveys and things like that. And so some people are turning to basically generative AI to produce kind of a representative sample of people. In a sense, like, I mean, it gets back to, though, all the assumptions that has to go into that, and this idea that data itself is never neutral, all only reflects what's in your data set. And it's two things. It's this faith or this belief that data can be neutral, and we can just pull it out of its context and create representative people. But in doing so, it just kind of destroys the whole point of doing a survey. But also, and the synthetic data 100%, because it gets back to that idea, you can never escape from people. One way to think about this is going back to like the 2008 global financial crisis. One of the reasons we got into that trouble was because banks tried to repackage bad investments as more good investments, because they were trying to make them synthetic and pass them off as something different. But at the end of the day, you still had the underlying investment there. And that basically is one of the things that almost sunk the entire global economy. And it's the same thing with synthetic data. You're piling on all these assumptions. But at the end of the day, it's still assumptions that you've made, as opposed to going out and doing an actual sampling of people out there. So this is an issue. So that's one of the issues. The other issue too is you want to do so much more and you don't have enough resources to do it. And they're trying to do, and so basically trying to do more with less. So funding is an issue, but and they see this as a way around that. And then there's the whole thing about like confidentiality, of course, of like feeding this, anything you feed into a chatbot, like you can't trust these companies. I mean, we've learned that for decades now. And you don't know how their data is going to be used, and it becomes part of their data set, and then people can be kind of recovered, or their data can be kind of like reverse engineered. Same thing with synthetic data. Like trying to make data can't be made fully anonymous. So these are huge issues that have to be that have to be considered as well.
Oh, that's a really great discussion too. There's so many big discussions that can come out of this meeting, but we're at 10:30, folks. Thank you for sticking around. Blayne, thank you for this conversation. I've learned a lot, and you caused me to think about things in a little bit different of a way. So I appreciate that. And I thank you. And we'll be having more conversations. If you're up to it, I may invite you back in a few months, and we can continue the conversation and focus it maybe on a little more on some of the questions that that came from this conversation. So thank you for participating, everybody. And you can feel free to go about the rest of your day. I didn't expect this to go past 10 o'clock, so thank you for sticking around, folks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.